We all know the feeling, right? So much to learn, so little time. That's where we come in. This is the deep dive, where we take stacks of your sources and boil them down to the good stuff. No need to wade through mountains of information. We do the heavy lifting for you.
And today's topic, something so basic it's easy to overlook. Categories. We're talking about how we divide up the world, make sense of it all. You sent in a really interesting mix of stuff with a special focus on categories we live by. The book by Gregory L. Murphy.
Absolutely. We're going to try to answer the big question. Are categories real things out there in the world, or are they all in our heads? Or, maybe a bit of both. And we'll look at where categories come from and why they matter so much. Expect some surprises along the way. Oh, and no worries, we're keeping it real. No boring academic jargon. You've given us a ton of sources, which really shows how categories are everywhere. Let's dive in, shall we? First up, are those categories we use every day real, or are we just making them up?
That's the million-dollar question. Murphy dives right in, asking whether categories are objective or if they're just products of how we think. Some categories, it's pretty clear, are definitely made up.
Yeah, totally. Like, he uses this example of sorting trees, ornamental, shade, fast-growing. Trees don't come with those labels attached, do they? We slap those categories on them based on how we want to use them, purely for our own landscaping convenience.
But then it gets deeper. Makes you wonder, if we can make up categories like that, what about categories that seem more like natural, like oak trees? Is that even a real category, or are we still just imposing it on the world based on our theories of biology?
Whoa. Okay, so even oak might be more of a human concept than we realize. And that brings up a whole other question. Who gets to decide what goes in what category? Like, is a palm tree really a tree? Who's the ultimate judge? And does it even matter?
Oh, it matters a lot. Because, as Freud said, categories are destiny. Murphy quotes that right at the start, and it's so true. Think about it. If society labels you as a certain gender, that shapes your whole life. It sets expectations, limits your opportunities, even dictates how people treat you.
It's so pervasive, and it's way more than just gender, right? Like, is that furry creature a cat or a dog? That simple label could decide whether you can even have it in your apartment. Or think about the legal system. If something's labeled a felony instead of a misdemeanor, it can be life-changing, prison time, losing your right to vote, all because of how we categorize and act.
Exactly. Even something as mundane as insurance is all about categories. Burst pipe in your house, that's covered. Flood damage, maybe not. Same water, different category, different outcome. And don't even get me started on health insurance virus versus pre-existing condition. Those categories can make or break you.
It makes you realize how much power those who create categories have. Their decisions impact us in such real ways. But here's a thought. Given that categories can oversimplify things, lead to prejudice, maybe we'd be better off without them.
It's tempting to think that, right? But Murphy makes this really strong case that actually we kind of need categories. As flawed as they are, they help us deal with the overwhelming complexity of the world.
Yeah, it's like without categories, every single decision would be this huge time-consuming process. Like, imagine having to relearn that tomatoes are edible every time you see one. We need that shortcut.
Right. We'd starve trying to figure out if every red round thing is food or poison. Categories save us time and energy. Even those person categories, like lawyer or artist, help us navigate social situations. Like Murphy's story about meeting that finance major.
Oh, yeah. Immediately gave him some common ground, a starting point for a conversation. It's not perfect, of course. That finance guy could be a killer guitar player in his spare time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But overall, having these categories makes life way more manageable. That's why it's so important to understand how they work, all the good and the bad.
For sure. And speaking of bad, those categories can really mess with our thinking, lead to some serious prejudice.
Oh yeah, like judging an entire group of people based on a stereotype, not good. But even with less loaded categories, there can be unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Remember Murphy's story about his friend who hates cheese?
Yeah. It's such a good example. Cheese is this huge category. Cheddar, mozzarella, camembert, they're all so different. To lump them all together and reject them all is kind of crazy, right?
Totally. It shows how a category can actually blind us to the amazing diversity within it. Makes you think, what other categories are we oversimplifying?
Okay, so if we're going to talk about categories, we need a working definition, right? Murphy offers a pretty straightforward one. A category groups things together that we treat as the same for some purpose, even though they're not actually identical.
And that last part is key. Even though they're not identical, like a dachshund and a greyhound. Totally different looking, but we treat them both as dogs. Same dog food, same vet.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about categories. We can see the differences, but still group them together based on some shared characteristic. It's how we make sense of the world, you know?
Right. And Murphy points out there are different ways to form categories. Sometimes it's a clear rule, sometimes it's just a feeling of what seems to belong together, and sometimes it's based on some deeper hidden property we don't even consciously notice.
Which brings us to the whole issue of definitions. We all learn those in school, right? Find the essential characteristic that makes something what it is, like a dog has four legs.
Ah, yes, the classic definition. And then someone points out that snakes don't have legs, and the whole thing falls apart. A good definition, we were taught, has to be both necessary, everything in the category has it, and sufficient, nothing outside the category has it. Tough to get that right.
And here's a little secret. Most dictionary definitions aren't actually definitions in that strict sense. They're more like descriptions of what's typical. Look up horse, and it'll say something like large, strong, four-legged with a mane and tail.
But a newborn foal isn't exactly large and strong, is it? And a horse that loses its tail is still a horse.
Wow.
So those are just common traits, not defining features.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll see a word like often in a definition. A muffin is often eaten hot, meaning not always. So again, it's describing typical usage, not setting a hard rule.
It goes deeper than dictionaries, though.
Yeah.
This is where Aristotle comes in. He believed categories had an essence, some core, unchanging property that determined membership. Either something had the essence or it didn't. No in between.
Very black and white. Works great for geometry, but real life is messier, right? Like, is that wobbly thing with three legs still a chair? Where's the line?
And yet, people cling to this idea of strict definitions. Even when our own categorization is inconsistent, we act like there must be some ultimate rule. Like deep down, we know what a chair really is, even if we can't explain it.
So if we ditch those rigid definitions, does that mean anything goes? Like, can I just decide my shoe is a chair now?
Uh-huh. It's a valid concern. But Murphy argues that we can function without those strict definitions. We have other ways of figuring out categories.
Which brings us to Wittgenstein. He really challenged that classical view of definitions. His famous example, games. Try to define game, and you'll see what he means.
Right. Board games, video games, the Olympics. What's the one thing they all have in common? Spoiler. There is one. Wittgenstein said categories work more like family resemblances. Some shared features, but no single feature defines the whole family.
It's really cool to try it yourself. Pick a category like chair or teacher and try to define it. You'll find it's tougher than you think. You can say some necessary things like a dog has to be alive, but that doesn't tell you everything that makes something a dog.
And you end up going in circles. Like defining a dog as a canine. That's just a synonym, not a real definition. This whole debate has even shaken up philosophy. Makes you realize those neat definitions don't always work, especially for big concepts like beauty or truth.
So maybe those perfect boundaries we imagine just don't exist. Which brings us to those tricky borderline cases. The stuff that's not quite in or out.
Oh yeah, the gray areas. Like, is a penguin really a bird? It can't fly the way we usually think a bird is flying. Is a chronic pain condition a disease? Is an octopus a fish? People argue about this stuff all the time.
And these aren't just random arguments. They happen because those borderline things share some features with typical members of a category, but not others. And it's not just everyday stuff. Even in science, where you'd think things are clear-cut, it gets fuzzy.
Right. We think of elements as being defined by their atomic number, how many protons they have. But take cesium, for example. It has isotopes, which are still cesium, but with different numbers of neutrons. So even a basic element isn't as simple as we might think.
So if those strict definitions fail us, how do we actually categorize things? We've talked about family resemblances. What else?
Well, there are goal-derived categories, as Murphy calls them. It's not about similarity, but about whether something helps us achieve a goal, like things to save from a fire.
Oh, I get it. Like, a photo album and a fire extinguisher aren't similar in themselves, but they both serve the goal of preserving something important during a fire.
Exactly. Or ways to travel to California cheaply. Hitchhiking, taking a bus, finding a crazy cheap flight. Different methods, same goal. It's the purpose that defines the category.
And those goal-derived categories can be really flexible. Like, my rich uncle's idea of a cheap flight is probably different from mine. It depends on the person and the situation.
Exactly. And then you have natural kinds like oak or bird. We think of these in terms of prototypes, a typical example. And those aren't based on our goals, but on how nature seems to be organized.
Hmm.
But then there are those tricky concepts that mix descriptive and ideal aspects, which can make things really confusing.
Like we have a sense of what something is and what it should be, and sometimes those clash. But all this gets even more complicated as science advances. Our categories can actually break down as we learn more.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like with sexual dimorphism in animals. Males and females of the same species can look totally different.
Hmm.
The black widow spider, for example. The female is way bigger, has that red hourglass, and is venomous. The male, tiny, no hourglass, harmless to us. They barely look like the same species.
So much for a simple prototype, right? And the bone worm takes it even further. The females are these worm-like creatures living in whale bones. The males, microscopic, they live inside the females. Talk about different.
It's mind-blowing. You couldn't categorize them based on looks alone. You need to know their evolutionary history, their genetics, to understand they're actually the same species.
It shows how sometimes you need deep knowledge to categorize things correctly, like knowing that a tadpole turns into a frog even though they look nothing alike, or that tuberculosis can affect different organs but is still the same disease.
Right. Sometimes our initial intuitions about categories are just flat out wrong. Which brings us to the fun part. Disagreements. How do we deal with those? Especially with borderline cases.
Like, is a waste paper basket furniture? Is a certain politician really a liberal? Those arguments can go on forever.
They can. But sometimes focusing on typicality can help. You might agree that, yeah, that waste paper basket isn't a very typical example of furniture, even if you disagree on the exact definition. And then there's language, which can just make everything more confusing.
The classic tomato debate. Technically, it's a fruit because of how it develops, but we use it as a vegetable in cooking. Same object, two different categories, same word, endless arguments.
And sometimes completely unrelated things have the same name. Bat, for example, flying mammal or baseball equipment. Totally different things. Language can be a tricky thing.
It can. It lumps together things that are different and separates things that are similar. You can't always trust it to reflect the real categories. But what about that idea that language actually shapes how we think? The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Ah, yes, the classic linguistic debate. Like, do the Inuit see snow differently because they have all these words for it?
Murphy argues it's more likely that the Inuit developed those words because they needed to make fine distinctions about snow. Living in that environment, different types of snow matter. Same with wine experts. They developed a fancy vocabulary because they were already making fine distinctions in taste.
Right. It's not that language forces us to create categories, but it does help us learn and talk about them. So language and categories are definitely intertwined, but it's complex.
And then you have the whole cultural aspect. Different cultures, different categories, especially for things like plants and animals.
Of course, the Australian outback has a totally different set of critters than, say, Europe. But what's interesting is that people across cultures tend to recognize some of the same basic biological categories, like oaks, trout, swallows.
It's like those are just too obvious to ignore, no matter where you live. But you do see a kind of devolution of that knowledge in modern societies. We're less connected to the natural world.
Definitely. People are more likely to just say tree or bird than to know the specific type. And then there's the constant change in science. Our categories get reclassified all the time as we learn more.
Like rabbits aren't rodents anymore, apparently, and those common names can be so misleading. The American robin isn't even a real robin, it's a thrush.
Right. And then there's chaining, where a name sticks around even though the thing itself changes. Like shampoo bottles used to be glass, now they're plastic, but we still call them bottles. So language is a starting point, but it can be deceiving.
Okay, so language isn't always reliable. What about rules and official definitions, like the stuff the FDA or the legal system comes up with?
Oh, those are a whole other can of worms. They try to set clear rules, but it gets messy fast. Take peanut butter, for example. Used to be just ground peanuts. Now it's got all kinds of additives. When does it stop being peanut butter?
And who decides? The FDA has to come up with these arbitrary cutoffs, like what percentage of peanuts is required. And even then, people might still call something peanut butter, even if it doesn't technically qualify.
Right, and this happens all the time. Salad dressing versus mayonnaise, custard versus ice cream, legal battles over almond milk. The Pringles case, where they argue their chips weren't really potato chips to avoid taxes, is a classic.
It really makes you realize that a lot of these decisions are about convenience, fairness, and common sense as much as about strict definitions. And the intent behind a rule matters too. Like, are e-bikes allowed on bike paths? Depends on whether the rule is about vehicles or about bikes.
Exactly.
What?
And those seemingly small distinctions can have huge consequences, like with felonies and misdemeanors. The criteria for each category can seem arbitrary, but they determine your life. Voting rights, prison time, all hinges on categorization.
Okay, now let's wade into some really deep waters. Psychiatric categories, such a sensitive topic. Historically, diagnoses were pretty subjective, right? But now there's this push for standardization, like with the DSM and ICD manuals.
It's all about making diagnosis and treatment more consistent, research easier. But can you really define mental illness with the same precision you define, say, a chemical element? Symptoms are fluid, people are complex. It's not like sorting rocks.
And there's a real debate about whether these categories reflect real underlying illnesses or if they're more like constructs we've created to understand distress. The fact that these manuals have miscellaneous categories tells you something. But there's also the possibility that some disorders, especially those linked to specific genes, might be more like those true natural kinds.
It's a fascinating area, and it makes you appreciate how much progress we've made since those vague 17th century categories for causes of death. Headache, surfeit, vomiting, not exactly precise.
No kidding. It's hard to imagine making medical progress with categories like that. It's like that old practice of bloodletting. They didn't have the categories to track outcomes properly, so they kept doing it, even though it was harmful. Categories matter, folks.
They do. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about biological species. You'd think that would be a clear-cut category, right? Scientists have this figured out.
That's what I always assumed. What could be more fundamental than a species?
Well, hold on tight, because this might surprise you. Most biologists don't think there's a single gene or even a set of genes that defines a species. And get this, there's no universally agreed upon definition of species. It's one of the biggest debates in biology.
Whoa, seriously, I had no idea. What were some of the ideas they tried before?
Well, they tried the whole essential properties thing like with other categories. Didn't work so well. Then they came up with the biological species concept, which basically said a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and make fertile offspring.
Like, dogs can breed with dogs, but not with cats. Seems logical.
Yeah, but it has problems. Some oak species can hybridize and make fertile offspring, even though they're different species. And what about asexual organisms? They don't interbreed at all.
So what's the current thinking then?
It's more about lineage's evolutionary history. A species is a line of descent from a common ancestor, like a family tree. So a species is a single, continuous line through time. Even those big categories we take for granted can be challenged. Turns out, fish don't really exist as a unified biological category.
Mind blown again. It's like everything we think we know is up for grabs. Okay, let's end with something a little more down to earth, but still surprisingly complex everyday food categories.
Oh yeah, those are great. Like peanut butter.
Yeah.
Such a basic thing, but it's changed so much over time. From just ground peanuts to this processed stuff with additives. When does it stop being peanut butter?
The FDA struggles with that, right? Trying to set those rules, what percentage of peanuts, what kinds of additives are okay. And even then, do people really care about the technical definition? We still call it peanut butter, even if it's not official.
And don't forget the almond milk debate. Is it really milk if it doesn't come from a cow? The dairy industry is fighting hard to keep that word for themselves. And then there's the Pringles case, arguing they weren't potato chips to avoid taxes. It's hilarious, but also makes you think.
It's all about convenience, fairness, common sense, not always about strict definitions. Okay, one last biggie. Racial categories.
Yeah, gotta be careful here. This is complex, loaded with history and social meaning. Do racial categories even exist as a biological reality? Some people say no, it's all social construct.
But we can't ignore the impact they have, right? Murphy points out that people often think about race in terms of essentialism. Like, there are fundamental differences between races, whether it's physical traits or even genes. But the science shows that most genetic variation is within racial groups, not between them.
Right. And skin color, which we often use as a marker of race, is so variable. People labeled black or white can have a huge range of skin tones. And then there are those borderline cases. Where do Egyptians fit in? Eastern Russians, Native Americans. It gets blurry fast.
And then there are the historical examples of how racial categories are constructed. The one-drop rule in the U.S. is a perfect example. Even a tiny bit of black ancestry meant you were categorized as black. That had real consequences, legal, social, everything.
Think about the Plessy v. Ferguson case, the separate but equal doctrine, all based on these constructed racial categories. Even Obama's categorization as black shows how complex and often arbitrary it is.
Okay, let's end with a category that's truly life or death, the category of death itself.
This one is different. We need a clear line here. Saying someone is kind of dead doesn't cut it. But defining death isn't as easy as you might think.
You'd think it would be obvious, right? No heartbeat, no breathing, end of story.
But it's not that simple. People can stop breathing temporarily and recover. Hearts can skip beats or even stop and restart. And with modern medicine, we can revive people whose hearts have stopped. The idea of irreversible loss of function becomes crucial. When can we say for sure that someone is beyond saving?
Right, technology has changed things. CPR, defibrillators, all that. And then there's brain death. That's the modern criteria in many places, irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem. But even that has its complexities.
Absolutely. The body can sometimes keep functioning with support, even if the brain is dead, and the tests for brain death aren't perfect. Plus, the criteria for brain death actually vary between countries.
Whoa, so you could be dead in one place but not another. That's wild. And then there are those cases that really challenge our definitions, like Leif Stedman, who lived for over a year with a completely artificial heart. Is he alive if his biological heart isn't functioning?
It really shows how technology pushes the boundaries of our categories. Even something as fundamental as life and death isn't always black and white.
So after all this, what have we learned? Categories are messy, complex, but we can't live without them. They help us make sense of the world, even if they're not perfect. Like Murphy's story about using spicy birdseed to deter squirrels. It didn't need to be a perfect category to work.
Exactly. But we also need to be careful, especially with social categories, stereotypes, prejudice, all that. We got to be mindful of the assumptions we make.
But that doesn't mean we should just ditch categories altogether. We rely on them constantly, like choosing a surgeon based on their qualifications,
Yep.
or understanding basic instructions.
And be wary of those know-it-alls who try to impose those hyper-specific definitions on everything. Language is flexible, context matters. Listen to experts, sure, but don't let them bully you with jargon in everyday conversations.
Right. Language is a starting point, not the final word. Similarity is helpful, but it can be deceiving. Especially as science progresses, we need to be open to revising our categories. Sometimes those lines we draw are arbitrary, but that doesn't mean they're useless. It's all about finding that balance between precision and practicality.
Ultimately, categories are tools. They reflect our needs, our understanding. They change over time. And when it comes to those tough decisions, we can't just hide behind definitions. We have to take responsibility for the categories we use, especially in those gray areas.
So, big takeaway. Categories are essential, but don't expect them to be neat and tidy. Embrace the messiness. It's all part of understanding how we humans make sense of the world.
And for you, our listener, here's a little challenge. Think about a category you use regularly, at work, in the news, wherever. Look at it through this new lens we've explored. What are its boundaries? What assumptions are hidden within it? It's a fascinating exercise, I promise.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. You've given us a lot to think about.
And we hope you'll keep exploring the world of categories. They're everywhere, shaping how we think and act. Until next time.
See ya.